Closing a bad student's account for instance, get out of here if you're angry. Come back when you are a valued customer. Wearing his uniform, George, the bank employee, stated this with a smug smile. I thought, what etiquette! He could enjoy himself. I thought it was rather cruel to have my account canceled. I thought about my choices and came up with a clever plan. All right, I'll go quietly, but could you maybe check one thing for me before I leave? What? Okay, hold on. I handed George my bank book and showed him the balance after displaying the transaction cannot be processed screen from the ATM. George's face became white as he repeatedly counted the zeros. I began planning my next course of action. In the interim, you can call me Alex Weston. After being admitted to my first choice institution, I was planning to move out on my own this summer. Leaving the house I've lived in for over 10 years is both exciting and nerve-wracking, but it's a vital step on the road to independence. I had decided in high school that I would move out of my uncle and aunt's house when I started college. In addition, my parents lost their lives in a car accident 10 years ago. My grandparents were too old to take care of me, so I was taken in by my uncle and aunt. Since they had no children of their own, they treated me as if I were their son. They allowed me to grow up and become an adult. Whenever I needed help with my studies, they took time out of their busy schedules to help. When I was teased at school for not having parents, they did everything they could to protect me. I am incredibly appreciative of them for taking care of me for a longer period of time than my parents ever did. A little early, but I want to thank Beth and Robert for everything. I sincerely appreciate the way you brought me up. On the day I got my letter of acceptance, I thanked them. Thank you, Alex. Being a parent for 10 years was a blessing. You've developed into a wonderful young man, and I can now inform your parents with pride. But in the summer, you'll have a lot to get ready for. You know, you can always return. Remember to give us a call occasionally. I'll send you anything you require. I felt a little ashamed when Beth wiped her tears with a handkerchief and grieved, even though it wasn't a final goodbye. But looking back, I realized I underestimated the reality of independence. I was shamefully unprepared for the responsibilities of daily life, as Robert and Beth had always handled them for me. I had no idea that preparing to live on my own would involve so many complicated tasks. From the moment I got my acceptance letter, I was buried under a mountain of things to do. Insurance, registration, opening a new bank account, and so on. Let's arrange for your tuition and fees to be deducted from your account, Alex. You should open a university account to manage your expenses and tuition separately. Once I found an apartment, I had to set up utilities like water, electricity, and gas. I also needed to buy furniture and appliances for my new place. I cursed my naivety for thinking I could relax now that the exams were over. Having rarely visited a bank before, everything felt completely new. I didn't even realize I needed to open an account, which became a funny anecdote. Can I just use my student ID instead? I was used to managing small amounts of pocket money or digital payments on my phone, so the thought of handling large amounts like tuition was terrifying. I felt so nervous that my hands trembled, knowing I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But since I was about to live on my own, I had to learn to handle transfers and payments myself. Until I got used to it, I planned to visit the ATM during quieter times when attendants were available to help. It seemed I wasn't the only one. This time of year, many students starting their solo lives were using banks for the first time. Most of the attendants were kind and patient, which was a lifesaver. But no matter how kind the majority might be, there are always exceptions, and I happened to meet one of those exceptions. Wow, I sighed at the nearest ATM corner. It was the 15th of an even-numbered month, and the ATM corner at Horizon Bank was packed. Being new to all this, I had forgotten it was pension day, which meant long lines at the ATM. To make matters worse, it was also the 5th and 10th, adding to the congestion. Some people were rushing in during a lunch break, creating a tense atmosphere. Adding to the tension was the ATM attendant, George, coming here on such a busy day. Of course it's crowded. If you don't know how to use a machine, come back when it's less busy. George's name tag was visible as he yelled at an elderly customer who seemed unsure of what to do. Without sparing a glance at the disheartened old man, George continued managing the line with little care or courtesy. His unhelpful attitude made me consider leaving, but I couldn't. I had forgotten an important payment, and today was the deadline. Overwhelmed by the flood of tasks, I had completely lost track of time. Since I would be out all evening, I had no choice but to make the payment now. Feeling cornered, I reluctantly joined the back of the line. After waiting nervously for a while, my turn finally came. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. George gave me a glance that seemed to say, "Can't this wait?" making me even more uneasy. Telling myself, "I've done this before," I inserted my bankbook and card into the machine. I carefully checked each step, worried about accidentally sending money to the wrong account. This slow, cautious process must have annoyed the people behind me. Meanwhile, George had been pacing behind me, making his presence impossible to ignore. Not done yet. The attendant leaned in to peer at my screen, making it hard to concentrate. "Could you not look at my pen, please? If you need assistance, feel free to ask. It's quite busy today." I turned around and found George standing so close that I could feel his breath. His words were polite, but they essentially meant, "Hurry up." Feeling flustered, I accidentally pressed the wrong button and had to start over. George's movements distracted me, and I made several more mistakes. "Are you a student? There are plenty of customers waiting behind you. If it's not urgent, why don't you come back later?" The sudden comment startled me as I focused on the transaction. Looking back, George's face clearly showed annoyance. The politeness he had earlier was completely gone. His attitude now made no attempt to hide his irritation, leaving me stunned. It's really frustrating, you know. People who don't know how to use the machine show up at the busiest times and hog the ATM. I bet your mom handled everything for you until now. While it was true that I hadn't done much on my own before, I'd just been a high school student buried in studies every day. At my age, it wasn't unusual to be unfamiliar with ATMs. Ignoring George's muttering, I finally managed to finish my transfer. I feel like I deserve a pat on the back. Hurry up and stop dawdling. Let the next person go. As I tried to put away my receipt and bankbook, George kept pestering me. The ATM's anti-forget alarm peeped repeatedly, sending me into a near panic. I wanted to yell, "I'm putting things away as fast as I can." But my bag zipper got stuck, and my wallet seemed to disappear into thin air. "Don't rush me." "Wait, what are you doing? My card is still in." Before I could finish, George shoved me aside. I hadn't retrieved my card yet. As I reached out in desperation, I let out a cry of despair. After the time limit expired, the ATM swallowed my card. Staring at the machine, I froze in disbelief. George glared at me with narrowed eyes. "This is why I can't stand slow ones. You don't even have much money in your account, yet you act like an important customer. Once a card is swallowed, it's a hassle to get it back." Apparently, retrieving a swallowed card required identity verification and paperwork. Getting scolded out of nowhere left me panicked and embarrassed. But then it hit me. This wasn't my fault, was it? If anything, George's rushing and shoving caused a mistake and made me leave my card behind. The realization cooled my head, and George's angry rant started to look ridiculous. He was probably trying to pin the blame on me to avoid acknowledging his own mistake. "Go to the counter and handle the paperwork. While you're at it, why not close your account too?" What's that supposed to mean? I couldn't help but ask. "Closing the account of a poor student like you. Get out of here. If you're upset, come back when you're a high-value customer." Sure, I was an inexperienced student, but even I knew this wasn't how a customer should be treated. It was obvious that George chose who to respect and who to belittle based on his own biases. Anger welled up in me. "Understood. I'll leave quietly, But before I go, could you check something for me? What? Up fine. Wait, what? I showed George the merciless message on the ATM screen. Transaction cannot be processed. Then I placed my bank book on the screen, seeing the balance. George froze, mouth agape. Let's just say the number of zeros in my balance was 6. This situation, where I can't access my funds, is your fault. Since the amount is significant, I'll consult my guardians and return later. I made sure George saw both the ATM screen and the bank book, ensuring he understood that his actions had caused a millionaire customer's funds to become inaccessible, a high-value customer. Why? How? You're just a student. Why does your account have such a large balance? Sadly, it's my inheritance from my parents and grandparents, since my parents died in an unexpected car accident. I received their life insurance and compensation later. When my grandparents passed away peacefully, I inherited their assets through legal succession. My grandparents had been relatively wealthy, which left me with a balance not typical for a student. My uncle, who is an attorney, not only took me in and raised me, but also managed my assets as my legal guardian. Now that I've turned 18 and legally become an adult, we decided that I would start managing those assets myself as I head to college. All the overwhelming paperwork stems from that decision. Having completed the transfer, I figured there was no risk of losing the card if the bank held onto it. Leaving George, who was still flustered, behind, I returned home. Since my uncle happened to be home, I told him everything that had happened. Following my uncle's advice, I sent a formal complaint about my experience to Horizon Bank. That very same day, the branch manager called to apologize. Please let me visit with George and offer our apologies in person. They made the offer, but I declined. He clearly underestimated me because I'm a student and treated me unfairly. I don't want someone like that knowing where I live, and honestly, I don't even want to see him. Even so, we need to return your card. It would be a burden to ask you to come in, so please allow us to deliver it to you. I'll come and pick it up myself. The branch manager was likely under pressure from higher-ups. They were quite insistent. As I went back and forth on the phone, my Uncle Robert, who had been listening, gestured for me to hand it over. This is Alex Weston's legal counsel, Robert Weston. Ah, yes, that's correct. The branch manager's shocked voice was audible even from where I stood. But my uncle, a seasoned professional, quickly resolved the situation. Soon enough, it was agreed that Robert and I would visit the bank to retrieve the card. When we arrived at the bank, we were immediately escorted to the reception room and treated with the utmost respect. While my uncle seemed used to this, I, who had been just a high school student until recently, was overwhelmed by the intimidating atmosphere. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. My sincerest apologies for my failure to properly train our staff, the branch manager said, bowing deeply. Meanwhile, George stood there with a sullen expression, only giving a slight nod. That wasn't an apology. It was a mere gesture of acknowledgement. Even I, inexperienced as I was, could tell the difference. Was this his usual attitude toward customers, or was he just having a bad day? After looking into it, we found that George had repeatedly exhibited this behavior toward customers. We were aware of occasional complaints, the branch manager admitted. According to him, working as an ATM or lobby attendant involved learning a lot of detailed procedures. Since the job also required dealing with increasingly demanding customers, turnover was high. With staff shortages already a problem, losing a permanent employee would be a big issue, so they often hired part-time workers through temp agencies. George, despite being a temp worker, had been at the bank for over 5 years. His knowledge of policy changes and operational details made him reliable in many ways. However, his moodiness and tendency to lose motivation after criticism were major drawbacks. The branch manager admitted he often struggled to manage George. Occasional complaints. Mocking someone struggling with a task and assuming a student must be poor, doesn't that go beyond occasional? I asked. You're absolutely right. I have no excuse. the branch manager said, wiping the sweat from his brow and visibly shrinking. Yet George hadn't even spoken up. He was just staring off into space while his boss kept apologizing on his behalf. He clearly had no intention of taking responsibility. "What did you say? You're just a student." "Stop it, George. You're cleaning up your own mess. Apologize properly." Though I had spoken more forcefully than I intended, it was still the branch manager who kept apologizing profusely. Meanwhile, George pressed his lips into a tight line, looking like he might snap back at any moment. "Fine. The account balance shows he's not poor. That part was my mistake," he finally said. "But he didn't earn that money himself. So what's with the attitude? Giving a kid this much money, what kind of parenting is that? No wonder things like this happen." When he finally opened his mouth, those were the words he chose. I felt a rush of blood to my head. My uncle gently stated, "Your disrespect has nothing to do with a person's private assets. Continuing to make unjust insults in front of me, an attorney, is not a wise choice." The air in the room froze at that comment. In the face of my uncle's commanding presence, even George, who had been behaving so boldly, became silent. My uncle went on to say, "Also, weren't you peeking at the ATM screen from behind? Using your position like that, whether or not you actually stole the PIN, it would be hard to deny if someone accused you of doing so." The air in the room froze at that comment. In the face of my uncle's commanding presence, even George, who had been behaving so boldly, became silent. My uncle went on to say, "Also, weren't you peeking at the ATM screen from behind? Using your position like that, whether or not you actually stole the PIN, it would be hard to deny if someone accused you of doing so." George and the branch manager both went white at those comments. Not to mention that before the lad had even gotten his card out of the ATM, you pushed him violently away. Furthermore, you publicly announced that he was a valuable customer for everyone in the vicinity to hear. My uncle resumed his tirade. Even though he was often composed and gentlemanly, when he became enraged, he would use all of his legal expertise to corner his opponent. I was aware of how frightening that may be. "This is quite unfortunate from a privacy and security standpoint. There is nothing else to do if personal information is compromised," he stated. After all, some might share George's belief that it's inappropriate for a student to hold significant wealth. I wasn't the one receiving the reprimand, so why was I perspiring? There was a noticeable tension. This must have been a nightmare for George and the branch manager, who were directly in charge. Between the insults to this boy, the matter of peeking at his PIN, and everything else, we have many grievances, my uncle stated. However, we don't want this to get out of hand. Let's change the PIN and have George sincerely apologize as a way to resolve things. Is that reasonable?" His remarks were brutal, yet his tone was kind, even joyous. In essence, he threatened to escalate the matter and notify the appropriate authorities if they failed to offer a sincere apology. George was in a vulnerable position as a temporary employee who had accidentally revealed a client's riches and looked at a customer's PIN. The branch manager, who was in charge of overseeing him, was also in danger. They would both be subject to harsh disciplinary punishment. At the very least, they might lose their employment in the worst situation. Should it turn into a lawsuit, the consequences would be disastrous. "I really regret the things I did while working for the bank." "Pardon me," George whispered. He apologized for the inconvenience, as did the branch manager, a few seconds later. Later, my uncle's legal office received a written suggestion for corrective actions from the branch manager. George's transfer was one of the measures mentioned, and I laughed in spite of myself. George found himself in a difficult situation after the incident was apparently extensively circulated among the bank employees as a warning story. After taking this event and George's previous conduct into account, the branch manager, who had long had trouble dealing with him, decided not to extend his contract. George would remain with the company until the end of his contract to avoid reprisals against me, but the temp agency had already been notified. He was essentially being let go. George, who had caused difficulties at his placement, would probably have a hard time finding another assignment at his advanced age of 50. Even if he did, the conditions would likely be even worse. I was not exempt from my uncle's reprimands, either. Flashing your bank book like that even to a bank employee was careless, he stated to me. I was also unable to argue. It was a challenging lesson. I've since changed my PIN and am getting ready to move into my new apartment, so for the time being I feel quite secure. Online banking is rather convenient, though I've noticed you've been avoiding it. Not at all. Additional applications. I had to let out a moan. I couldn't handle the idea of filling out additional papers after this deluge of paperwork. My never-ending ordeal with bureaucratic hell appeared to be far from ended.